Have you ever found yourself in theological debate over the Trinity doctrine? If yes, how did it go? In recent decade, the Seventh-day Adventist Church has been going through a great controversy over the theological pruning of the Trinity doctrine. It is very likely that you have been involved in a discussion over this doctrine, or you have come across somebody who does not share the same views as you do. Personally observing these debates, I believe that heaven is sad seeing this war in our church between the anti-Trinitarians and pro-Trinitarians, because the basic principles of loving and constructive dialogue is often violated. I have observed that people are more concerned about winning the argument than losing their fellow brethren. The famous philosopher of science Karl Popper said, "The aim of argument or discussion should not be victory but progress." And when it comes to the Trinity discussions and arguments in our church, it is almost but all a regress. People often do not listen to the other side, and often in their arguments they falsely represent the same. The arguments they bring forth are misrepresentation of the opposing views brought in such a way that they may be easily refuted and therefore prove themselves a victory. Then the naming and labels follows. Whenever I come to a Facebook group, whether it be an anti-Trinitarian or pro-Trinitarian, I recognize these patterns. People fail to understand that such behavior is sin, because it's breaking of the 9th commandment. Now, many people see and recognize such behaviors and rightfully disengage for any discussions and agitation of the matter. They believe that this issue is not important, or even they claim it is important not to engage in questioning the matter. I can understand them because I was one of them, but with all fairness in mind, I cannot agree that we should be ignorant of who is the God we ought to worship. We are Seventh-day Adventists, and God raised us for the purpose of proclamation of 3 angels' messages, for which the first message in particular deals with the question, who is God we ought to worship? It says, "Fear God and give glory to Him, for the hour of His judgment is come, and worship Him that made heaven and earth and sea and the fountains of waters." So, who is this God we ought to worship? Is this God a Trinity or not? If we are called to proclaim the 3 angel messages, then this becomes a very important and fundamental issue. As well, "For God so loved the world that He gave His only begotten Son," should I accept this testimony in its obvious meaning and accept God who does have a son? The issue at stake is very fundamental to our faith, and this cannot be an irrelevant topic by any means. But what shall we do? If you engage in any arguments, you're very likely to be labeled and ruin some of your relationship with your fellow brothers and sisters. I have a proposal for this issue. I'm not proposing a solution, but only one tiny step toward a constructive dialogue, which is heavily needed. So instead of proving the opposite side wrong, how about proving the other side right? It's called a common ground. It is the search of the area where both sides can say amen and they can agree. And then from that place, you can start expanding your views to find more of a common ground. I've never seen any study doing this before, and this is maybe the first time in the history of Seventh-day Adventist Church, recent history, that we're about to endeavor to do this. We're going to find a common ground between the Trinitarians and anti-Trinitarians. And now probably someone will object saying that this is impossible. The view of God from anti-Trinitarian perspective and Trinitarian perspective are 2 mutually opposing views. Or are they? Really? I have an interesting discovery to share with you. Personally, I've been in this controversy for more than 8 years now, and I've looked into majority of relevant resources from both sides. And with those resources, I can understand someone claiming that there is no common ground between these 2 camps. But when I did my own independent research of Ellen White writings, the data had led me into a deeper understanding of the matter. In my experience with talking with a lot of Adventists, even prominent individuals from both sides, I can responsibly claim that once the matter is observed in its essence, there is a plenty of common ground to find between these two opposing camps. I'm not claiming they believe the same, but I'm saying that there is a big common area when rightly understood and acknowledged. The further dialogue becomes much easier and constructive. In my opinion, 90% of public discourse about the Trinity is a waste of time because two sides are so antagonistic to each other, they cannot hear the other side as nothing they could agree with. Yet I claim responsibly that they do have plenty of things to agree with each other if they would stop being antagonistic and start to look for a common ground in the very essence of the matter. The essence of the matter we find in the writings of Ellen White. Both sides extensively quote Ellen White writings, and this is the reason why, superficially looking, Ellen White is contradicting herself. And this is far from the truth. There is a way to put in harmony all of her writings, and that harmony is a common ground. I will restate this again. When the matter is observed on a superficial level, which is often the case, the entire thing is confusing and contradicting. But when the matter is observed in its essence, there is a plenty of common ground, and the things are simple and easy to understand. You may wonder, who am I, or who do I even think I am to do this? Well, I'm a member of Seventh-day Adventist Church, I love my church, and I want to serve my church without compromising the truth. And I think this is a good starting point in finding a common ground. I believe that the perspective I found in my own independent research is by majority of Seventh-day Adventists in both camps a common ground. And by bringing this data to the spotlight, I know that this will result in a constructive dialogue which would edify our church. Together with a friend of mine and fellow brethren, I published this research in 2 books. One is The Forgotten Pillar, and the other one is Rediscovering the Pillar. In this video, I want to present to you data which I believe is by and large a common ground between these two opposing and antagonistic sides. We are going to scratch the surface from these books, and I will often refer to them because there is a lot of data to cover, which is impossible to cover in a short amount of time. Another important thing to say is that I'm not a spokesperson of either of camps. I've been misrepresented, attacked, and censored from both groups. And also I keep very good relationship with brethren on the both sides. I know that someone will not like the idea of a common ground and they will find it disturbing, but there is no way to make this important subject edifying unless there is a constructive dialogue, and the common ground is the first step to the constructive dialogue. Although these videos will be a bit longer than usual, I can promise you will certainly have multiple epiphany moments. Your attitude toward the spirit of prophecy is the determining factor of finding a common ground. If you deem Ellen White to be a prophet of God and you respect her writings as revelation from God, then we will certainly have a common ground. If you do not respect the spirit of prophecy, it is very likely that we will not have a common ground. I don't care if you're some pastor, scholar, or some prominent anti-Trinitarian voice. If you do not respect the authority of Ellen White, we will not have a common ground. But anyways, keep watching. Because the writings of Ellen White will just help us to understand the essence of the matter. The essence of the matter is easily seen in the Bible, for that we don't need the spirit of prophecy, but it is amazing to see how Sister White is handling this very controversy we have today. Now, you must pay a close attention to my presentation and see if my approach to her writing is fair, And also, you will judge me if I'm potentially misrepresenting your camp. You should hold me accountable for presenting the matter fairly. So it's kind of a challenging thing, but actually it's not so hard. Because all that I will do is to present relevant but raw data from which you will draw conclusions yourself. People think if they read one or two books from Adventist scholars or some prominent voices in anti-Trinitarian camps, that they know and understand everything. Now, that being said, it is important to emphasize the fact that the majority of data I'm about to present to you was not available prior to 2015. In 2015, Ellen White estate finally published all of her letters and manuscripts. So I did analysis of my own book, and there is about 63% of Ellen White's quotations which were not available prior to 2015. I'm saying this because there is a need to do your independent research. And I hope this study will give you a good direction to look into. You will get a lot of new keywords which you can type into Ellen White's search engine. I need to remind you that this study will be longer studies than usual because we are running a marathon of the data, but with the speed of a sprinter. So videos are a little bit longer, but I promise you after the study you will going to be at the top of the data and you will understand how to address our issues constructively and most importantly how to behave in the way that heaven approves. We have a clear revelation to this. So how do we know this? We're going to find it out by examining the exact behavior of Sister White when she was faced with the very same situation we have today. Yes, in the time of Ellen White, our church had a Trinitarian controversy. And this is the data we're going to examine. Are you ready? So what Sister White has to say about the Trinity doctrine. So let's look at the raw data. I'm going through the old Ellen G. White writings. It's you just append legacy.agwwritings.org. And in the search, I will type in Trinity. And because we're looking for raw data, I will exclude compilations. So I will just put lifetime works from 1845 to 1917. So in 1917, they published like all publications of her when she was alive. Everything after are compilations. And compilations are not raw data. I mean, they're important. We're going to also look into them later. But for now, we're just looking for the raw data, what Sister White has to say about Trinity when she was writing. So we hit search, and there's like two results. But if we look more carefully, we see that they are the same. So I'm going to click on this. Just make it bigger for you to see. And then we read. This warning now comes to you, and what will you do with it? Will you say, have no fear of me? But be aware of that which the old writers called the world's Trinity, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life. If you trifle and trample with these, they will prove you ruin, and so on. So here, Sister White is using the word Trinity, and that's the only occasion she does this. And she says the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life. And this is letter, so this was not present prior to 2015. But we have some clue that she knew about the Trinity and she was writing, but this clue does not say that God is Trinity, because she's actually talking about not about the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, but about the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life. How can we know if Sister White was dealing with the Trinity doctrine if she never directly used the word Trinity? If she was never dealing with the Trinity issue, then she must have addressed those issues indirectly. And how can we find those instances? We have them when other peoples around her were dealing with the Trinity doctrine, and she was either quoting them or referring to their Trinitarian sentiments. and luckily we have those instances. The only challenge here is to properly understand the historic and literal context. One such instance is Sister White's letter to Dr. Kellogg, and that letter is letter 253 from 1903. I want to pack as much information as possible into shortest time, so I will play a video for you as a short introduction to Ellen White's letter 253 from 1903. It is only 7 minutes, so please do not be quick with conclusions because we will dive deeper into the matter after it. So letter 253 will open to us the area which is a common ground. So let's watch. The Trinity doctrine cannot be accepted by those who are loyal to the faith and to the principles that have withstood all the opposition of satanic influences. This is a contextual rendering of Sister White's letter to Dr. Kellogg, when she actually wrote patchwork theories cannot be accepted. The patchwork theories are referring to the theories Dr. Kellogg wanted to patch up his book. Sister White wrote to him, "The book Living Temple is not to be patched up. A few changes made in it and then advertised and praised as a valuable production." The context reveals that the patch by which Dr. Kellogg wanted to fix his book was the Trinity doctrine. We see this from the letter of Brother Daniels to Sister White's son, William White. Daniels wrote, "Ever since the council close, I have felt that I should write you confidently regarding Dr. Kellogg's plans for revising and republishing the Living Temple. He said that some days before coming to the council, he had been thinking the matter over and began to see that he had made a slight mistake in expressing his views. He then stated that his former views regarding the Trinity had stood in his ways of making a clear and absolute correct statement, but that within a short time he had come to believe in the Trinity and could now see pretty clearly where all the difficulty was and believed that he could clear the matter up satisfactorily. He told me that he now believes in God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Ghost, and his view was that it was God the Holy Ghost, and not God the Father that filled all space and every living thing. He said if he had believed this before writing the book, he could have expressed his views without giving the wrong impression the book now gives." This letter was dated on October 29, and this is the response of William White. "Dear brother, Mother and I have just read your letter of October 29 in which you speak of various plans that have been proposed for the revising and reproduction of the Living Temple. We were pleasantly surprised at the announcement that Dr. Kellogg would withdraw this book from the market, and we are sorry indeed that his mind is swinging back to the plan of revising it. Mother expressed herself quite emphatically regarding this matter. She regards it as unprofitable undertaking." William White testified that his mother, that is Ellen White, and he had together read the Daniels letter about Kellogg's intention to revise and reproduce the Living Temple because of his beliefs in the Trinity doctrine. Sister White regarded this thing as an unprofitable undertaking. This is why she wrote directly to Dr. Kellogg. The book Living Temple is not to be patched up. A few changes made in it and then advertised and praised as a valuable production. The theory by which Dr. Kellogg wanted to patch up his book was the Trinity doctrine. Therefore, the patchwork theories, or Trinity, cannot be accepted by those who are loyal to the faith and to the principles that had withstood all opposition of satanic influences. I hope you see the context why the patchwork theories is a reference to the Trinity doctrine. Dr. Kellogg wanted to revise his book, The Living Temple, by patching up with the Trinity doctrine. So the context is clear, but what can we learn from this letter? In this instance, we do not see Ellen White adhering to the Trinity. But this is a very superficial approach and observation to the issue. Now anti-Trinitarians like, see, she's against the Trinity. And looking at this instance, the fair answer is yes. But be not quick to judge, because the reason why Sister White is opposing the Trinity doctrine here is something that the majority of Trinitarians, and more precisely the Seventh-day Adventists, today agree with. We will now go to examine those reasons because these very reasons are our common ground. The Trinity doctrine cannot be accepted by who and why. She says the patchwork theories cannot be accepted by those who are loyal to the faith and the principles that have withstood all opposition of satanic influences. Sister White was recalling the past experiences of how God has established some principles which represented our faith. As we're going to see, those principles of our faith were the fundamental principles. By those who are adhering to these principles, the Trinity cannot be accepted. Now, there are a lot of Trinitarian brethren watching this who are not aware of what the fundamental principles are, but if you would discuss with them the essence of the teaching, you would find that they indeed believe in the same way, but they are not aware of the existence of such a thing as the fundamental principles. As you're going to see later, the fundamental principles was a term denoting the official beliefs of Seventh-day Adventist Church in the time of Ellen White. We even had an official document declaring those teachings. For many brethren watching this, they're getting the new crucial information here. Again, Sister White said that patchwork theories, in that in context is the Trinity, cannot be accepted by those who are loyal to the faith and to the principles that have withstood all opposition of satanic influences. Sister White wrote about the experiences in our past history of how God gave us these principles and how they were cruelly opposed and falsified, and how these principles have prevailed. Sister White is telling us a specific story, and we should not be mistaken about it. In our short video, this is not read, but let us read this data and become familiar with these principles, which, as we're going to see, are the common ground between the anti-Trinitarians and pro-Trinitarians by large numbers. My husband, Elder Joseph Bates, Father Pierce, Elder Edson, and many others who were keen, noble, and true were among those who, after the passing of times in 1844, searched for the truth. At our important meetings, these men would meet together and search for the truth as for the hidden treasure. I met with them and we studied and prayed earnestly, for we felt that we must learn God's truth. Often, we remained together until late at night, and sometimes through the entire night praying for light and studying the Word. As we fasted and prayed, great power came upon us, but I could not understand the reasoning of the brethren. My mind was locked, as it were, and I could not comprehend what we were studying. Then the Spirit of God would come upon me, and I would be taken off in vision, and a clear explanation of the passages we have been studying would be given me with instruction as the position we were to take regarding the truth and duty. Again and again this happened. A line of truth extending from that time to the time when we shall enter the city of God was plainly marked out for me, and I gave my brethren and sisters the instruction that the Lord has given me. They knew that when not in vision I could not understand these matters, and they accepted as light direct from heaven the representation given me. Thus the leading points of our faith as we hold them today were firmly established. Point after point was clearly defined and all brethren came into harmony. The whole company of believers were united in truth. There were those who came in with strange doctrines, but we were never afraid to meet them. Our experiences was wonderfully established by the revelation of the Holy Spirit. So in this letter to Dr. Kellogg, she is recalling to him the story how we have received these principles in our past history. So here's a quick question. At what time period in our Adventist history Sister White was referring to when she was explaining how we received our faith, a Seventh-day Adventist faith? She was referring to the period after the passing of time in 1844. And she's mentioning so specific names: James White, Stephen Pierce, Harold Edsom, and others from that time period. So God has, as it says here, that He has revealed the leading points of our faith as we hold them today. Then they were firmly established. Point after point was clearly defined, and all brethren came into harmony. So James White, Stephen Pierce, Harold Edsom, and other pioneers from that time period who were loyal to the faith and the principles of our faith indeed could not accept the Trinity. Did you know that today we would label all those faithful men as the anti-Trinitarians? And that is easy to prove from their works, but we have no time to go over this evidence. But rather we're going to look into the principles which defined our faith and their faith in order to see the essence, why these people could not accept the Trinity doctrine. We're going to look into that essence, and surprisingly you will find that the majority of Seventh-day Adventists today believe in the essence of the matter, although the majority of them subscribe their beliefs to the Trinity doctrine. And this is a realistic picture. So don't get confused here, because we are searching for common ground between non-Trinitarians and Trinitarians. Take it this way. Is there a common ground between the founders of our church, which were undoubtedly non-Trinitarians, and the majority of our church members today, which do profess their belief in the Trinity? So let's find this common ground in the data. Again, the statement we are examining is that the Trinity doctrine cannot be accepted by those who are loyal to the faith and to the principles that have withstood all opposition of satanic influences. So let's read in the letter of Ellen White to Dr. Kellogg about these experiences and experiences of opposition to this truth. After the passing of time, we were opposed and cruelly falsified. Erroneous theories were pressed in upon us by men and women who have gone into fanaticism. I was directed to go to these places where these people were advocating these erroneous theories. And as I went, the power of the Spirit was wonderfully displayed in rebuking the errors that were creeping in. Satan himself, in the person of men, was working to make of no effect my testimony regarding the position that we now know to be substantiated by scriptures. Okay. Can we get more specific? Do we know what exactly was the position which was substantiated by the scripture, and what exactly was under the attack? And the answer is yes. So let's look at the data, because this leads us to the common ground. So let's listen carefully. Just such theories you presented in the living temple were presented then. These subtle, deceiving sophistries as again and again sought to find place among us. But I have ever had the same testimony to bear which now I bear regarding the personality of God. Did you catch that? Here we have it. From all the truths we have received in early days of our work, Sister White is pinpointing to in her testimony regarding the personality of God. So is the personality of God a common ground? So let's read. And if the Trinitarian brethren agree with the statements given, and anti-Trinitarian brethren agree with the statements given, then we have a common ground. Then we can work out from there. So let's read. But I've ever had the same testimony to bear, in which now I bear regarding the personality of God. And now she quotes herself. In early writings, page 60, 66, and 67 are the following statements. May 14, AD 51, I saw the beauty and loveliness of Jesus. As I beheld his glory, the thought did not occur to me that I should ever be separated from his presence. I saw a light coming from the glory that encircled the Father, and as it approached near to me, my body shook and trembled like a leaf. I thought that if it should come near me, I would be struck out of existence, but the light passed me. Then could I have some sense of the great and terrible God with whom we have to do. So she's talking about her experience when she have met God and she's pointing to the Father that had passed near her. And then says, I have often seen the lovely Jesus that he is a person. I asked him if his Father was a person and had a form like himself. Said Jesus, I'm the express image of my Father's person. So here we see that Father she could not have seen, but she could see Jesus, that he is a person. And because the Father she could not have seen, she had a question regarding the Father. Was he also a person and had a form also like Jesus has a form? So Jesus said, I'm the express image of my Father's person. She continues and says, I've often seen that the spiritual view took away all the glory of heaven, and that in many minds the throne of David and the lovely person of Jesus had been burned up in the fire of spiritualism. I've seen that some who have been deceived and led into this error will be brought out into the light of truth, but it will be almost impossible for them to get entirely rid of the deceptive power of spiritualism. Such should make thorough work in confessing their errors and leaving them forever. Sister White gave her brief testimony from our history on the personality of God. So remember, we are talking about the Trinity issue here. And now Sister White points us back to when she met God in person. She has something to say about God and his person. And the question is, can anti-Trinitarians and Trinitarians alike agree about the testimony which Ellen White has to say about God? Trinitarians have many claims about God, and so anti-Trinitarians. But can they both agree with the claim that Sister White has about God? The doctrine on the personality of God is dealing with the question, is the Father a person, and does he has a form just like Jesus has? The answer to this question is affirmative in its obvious sense. And can anti-Trinitarians agree with this? And as you're going to see later in our study, not all anti-Trinitarians can agree with that. But certainly anti-Trinitarians, which were our pioneers, indeed can agree with this. Can Trinitarians agree with this? And in my experience, I found many Trinitarians who do not agree with these statements. But many, if not majority, do agree. What I'm saying, not all anti-Trinitarians are the same. Neither are all Trinitarians the same. If we want to have a constructive dialogue, which will edify our church, we need to make this difference. The common ground is only between one sort of Trinitarians and one sort of anti-Trinitarians. The question at hand is about God's person. And that's the essence of the matter. Just Trinity and non-Trinity approach is superficial, which brings us nowhere. We need to deal with the essence of the data. So let's expand this data with our history in order to see why the question, if the Father has a form like Jesus, is why this question is important. So let's read from Biography of Ellen White about these particular experiences from her grandson, Arthur Lacey White. So we are reading from the Biography of Ellen White, written by her grandson, Arthur Lacey White. And that's written in Ellen G. Wright's early years with Wrestling with the View of Spiritualizers. In Eastern Mayenne, Ellen was traveling and working in the atmosphere of spiritualizers who allegorized away heaven, God, Jesus, and Advent hope. In the vision of Exeter in the mid-February, she seems to be in the presence of Jesus, and she was eager to produce answer to some vital questions. I asked Jesus if his Father had a form like himself. He said he had, but I could not behold it, for, said he, if you once behold the glory of his person, you would cease to exist. Does the Father have a form like Jesus has? So this was a vital question. Now he says, this was not the only occasion Ellen was to converse with Jesus and the angel about person of Jesus and concerning God being a personal being. The answer satisfied her fully that the spiritualizers were in gross error. The question, does the Father has a form like Jesus, was a question dealing about the person of Jesus and concerning God being a personal being. Is God a personal being? If you are anti-Trinitarian, ask yourself this question. Likewise, if you are Trinitarian, ask yourself this question as well. And please do not be superficial. If God is a personal being for you, then ask yourself why. In which specific way is God a personal being? In the visions of Ellen White, we see that the way God was a personal being was that he has a form. In our history, this question was of a vital importance, and here is why. But because the pioneers of Seventh-day Adventist Church have held that prophecy was fulfilled on October 22nd, AD 44, and that the important work began in heaven in the most holy place of the heavenly sanctuary at that time, and because the Adventists who had become spiritualizers took the position that Christ had come into their hearts on October 22nd, AD 44, and that his kingdom was in their hearts, the founders of the church, and notably Ellen White, were classed by the world generally, and also by those that Seventh-day Adventists have termed the First-day Adventists, as one and the same group. Here again, the great enemy cast aspersion upon the true, paralleling it with a false spurious experience. Ellen White was to speak of this matter again, particularly to closing paragraphs of her little book, Experience and Views, published in AD 51. As one reads this, he will know that the use of the term spiritualism, which must be taken in light of the work of spiritualizers, and not in the light of what today is understood to be spiritualism or spiritism, although both emanate from the same source. We turn now to the statements written and published in AD 51 as found in early writings, page 77 and 78. I frequently be falsely charged with teaching view particular to spiritualism. Before the editor of Daystar ran into that delusion, the Lord gave me a view of the sad and desolating effects that would be produced upon the flock by him and others in teaching the spiritual views. Okay? I have often seen the lovely Jesus that he's a person. I asked him if his father was a person and had a form like himself. Said Jesus, I am the express image of my Father's person. Now she still comments, I've often seen that the spiritual view, mark these words, took away all the glory of heaven, and that in many minds the throne of David and the lovely person of Jesus had been burned up in the fire of spiritualism. I have seen that some who have been deceived and led into this error will be brought out into the truth, but it will be almost impossible for them to get entirely rid of the deceptive power of spiritualism. Such should make thorough work in confessing their errors and leaving them forever. And that's the end of the quote from Ellen White. Now Arthur Lacey White comments, the spiritualization of heaven, God, Christ, and the coming of Christ lay at the foundation of much of the fanatical teachings that 17 years old Ellen Harmon was called upon by God to meet in those formative days. The visions firmly establish the personality of God and Christ, the reality of heaven, and the reward of the faithful and the resurrection. This sound guidance saved the emerging church. Regardless of if you're Trinitarian or anti-Trinitarian, ask yourself, do you believe that the prophetic event of 2,300 days and night prophecy, which was fulfilled in AD 44, was it a real event in time and space? Or was it some kind of spiritual occurrence? Seventh-day Adventists believe that AD 44, that there was a real event happen in heaven. Christ came, not on earth, but he came to the Ancient of Days in heaven. Seventh-day Adventists believe that the heaven is a real place. Do you believe that the heaven is a real place? I hope you can affirmatively answer to this question, because Jesus said, in my Father's house are many mansions. If it were not so, I would have told you, I go to prepare a place for you. And then he went into heaven. So the heaven is a real place with real mentions there. If it were not so, Jesus would have told us. But spiritualists deny that. The same reasoning goes with the sanctuary in heaven. Is it a real sanctuary where Christ is a minister of a sanctuary of the true tabernacle which Lord pitched and not man? Again, spiritualists deny the real physical existence of sanctuary in heaven. And you may even hear this from our pulpits. If you believe that the sanctuary is a real place, then because of the blueprint that we have, we know that there is a throne of God in it, and Jesus is ministering to us there at the right hand of God. So do you believe this in a literal sense or some spiritual sense? Do you believe the throne of God is a literal physical throne where God sits? Or does it only have some spiritual implication? Sister White's question was very precise to the point, asking Jesus if his Father was a person having a form just like him, because she saw Jesus having a physical body. Jesus answered that the Father indeed has a form, but cannot be seen by the mortal sight. So this answer satisfied her fully that the spiritualizers were in a gross error. And then she said, I've often seen that the spiritual view took away all the glory of heaven, and that in many minds the throne of David and lovely person have been burned up in the fire of spiritualism. Does God have a form is a question which dispels the spiritual view of God. If God does not have a bodily form, then there is no point of believing in a real throne of God in heaven, and consequently in a real sanctuary in heaven, and consequently in heaven as a real place after all, nor in Jesus' physical ascension to heaven to be at the right hand of God. Do you see that question, does God have a form, is a foundational question to our Seventh-day Adventist faith? Who would have ever thought that? This teaching is called the doctrine on the personality of God. And as we are going to see later, it was the pillar of our faith in equal rank with the sanctuary message. But more about that later. So, regardless if you believe in Trinity or not, ask yourself, do you believe that the Father has a bodily form? If yes, then we have a common ground. You may think that the question, does God have a bodily form, is irrelevant, especially for spiritualists, but we as the Seventh-day Adventists had a complete teaching regarding this doctrine, and we call this doctrine the personality of God. We have this doctrine expressed in the official Seventh-day Adventist belief during that time. Before I get into the point of official Seventh-day Adventist beliefs in the time of Ellen White, I want you first to get acquainted with the fact that we had an official belief as Seventh-day Adventists. Sister White is referencing them in the numerous way in her letter to Dr. Kellogg. She was recalling experiences of how our pioneers have received this truth. And she was recalling how God was using her to give her visions in order to lead brethren into the Bible when they find the entire truth. She says, again and again, this happened. A line of truth extending from that time to the time when we shall enter the city of God was plainly marked out before me. And I gave my brethren and sisters the instruction that the Lord has given me. They knew that when not in vision I could not understand this matter, and they accepted as light direct from heaven the revelation given me. Thus the leading points, she's mentioning points of our faith, as we hold them today, this is in time of Ellen White, were firmly established. Point after point was clearly defined, and all brethren came into harmony. She's mentioning the leading points of our faith, and she says point after point was clearly defined, and all brethren came into harmony. So what are these points, and where can we learn about these points which constitutes the faith of Seventh-day Adventists at that time? We find them in a document called A Declaration of the Fundamental Principles taught and practiced by Seventh-day Adventists. In the preface we read, in presenting to the public this synopsis of our faith, we wish to have it distinctly understood that we have no articles of faith, creed, or discipline aside from the Bible. We do not put forth this as having any authority with our people, nor is it designed to secure uniformity among them as a system of faith, but as a brief statement of what is and has been with great unanimity held by Seventh-day Adventists. We often find it necessary to meet inquiries on this subject and sometimes to correct the false statements circulated against us and to remove erroneous impressions which have obtained with those who have not had an opportunity to become acquainted with our faith and practice. Our only object is to meet this necessity. So they were falsely accused and just say, Seventh Adventists believe this nonsense, and therefore they have put this document out to say what Seventh-day Adventists believe, and they call it a declaration of the fundamental principles taught and practiced by Seventh-day Adventists. So those principles and points are the points we have received in the beginning after the passing of time of AD 44, when those men, keen, noble, and true of intellect, were searching for the truth as for the hidden treasure. So these points are called the fundamental principle. And briefly said, the first time when this document was published was in AD 72 as a tract, as you can see in the scan. This was a public statement of what Seventh-day Adventists believe. And back in those days, they did not have the internet to make a public statement. So they were publishing this document every year until December 1914 in yearbooks. And in July 1915, Sister White died. These points were clear and definite, and they officially represented what we as church believed at that time. It is surprising that today many Seventh-day Adventists had never heard of such a thing as the fundamental principles. For them, this is the new thing. And it is even the greatest surprise when you learn and read from Ellen White writings on her statements on the fundamental principles, where she is calling them to be the foundation of our faith. And the one big document you can read it's the entire chapter called The Foundation of Our Faith from the Special Testimonies, where she is calling the fundamental principles to be the foundation of our faith. In the first chapter of the book, you can read the entire chapter. It's just copy-paste. So let's get back to our context of Dr. Kellogg and his revision of Living Temple with the Trinity. In that context, Ellen White is writing a letter after she has recalled all our past experiences, how we received the fundamental principles. She says the following: as a people, we shall stand firm on the platform that had withstood tests and trials. We shall hold to the sure pillars of our faith. The principles of truth that God has revealed to us are only foundation. They have made us what we are. They have made us Seventh-day Adventists. The principles that have withstood all opposition of satanic influences refers to the platform that has withstood the test and trial. This platform refers to the principles of truth that God has revealed to us as our only foundation. This platform or principles, they have made us what we are. These are the fundamental principles. The platform that had withstood the test and trial, and the principles which have withstood all the opposition of satanic influences are one and the same thing. The fundamental principles. So let's rewind back a little bit. Sister White said that the Trinity doctrine cannot be accepted by those who are loyal to the faith and the principles that had withstood all opposition of satanic influences. Obviously, she's talking about the old Seventh-day Adventist faith, the fundamental principles. And more specifically, in recalling the experiences of how God raised our faith, and she was specifically pinpointing to the doctrine on the personality of God. Now, the question is, does the fundamental principles contain a point which is dealing with the personality of God? And the answer is yes. It is the very first point of the fundamental principles. So the first point says that there is one God, a personal spiritual being. Remember, personal being. The creator of all things, omnipotent, omniscient, and eternal. Infinite in wisdom, holiness, justice, goodness, truth, and mercy. Unchangeable and everywhere present by his representative, the Holy Spirit. Did you catch it? Seventh-day Adventists believe that one God is a personal spiritual being. Let me remind you what Arthur Lacey Wright wrote after Sister White had this vision, and when she asked, does the Father had a form like himself? And Jesus says, yes, he has. And the conclusion says, this was not the only occasion Ellen White to converse with Jesus and the angel about the person of Jesus and concerning God being a personal being. The doctrine on the personality of God is expressed in the first point of the fundamental principles as one God, a personal spiritual being. We're going to dive deep into the teaching of the personality of God in the next study, but here I just want to point you to the behavior of Sister White when she was personally dealing with the Trinity doctrine through Kellogg's crisis. Dr. Kellogg wanted to patch up his book with the Trinity, and Sister White wrote him a personal letter addressing two things in response to his Trinitarian beliefs. And this is really important for us today. Number one, she's pointing us back in time when God has given us the doctrines which make us Seventh-day Adventists, and those are the fundamental principles. And number two, she's talking about the personality of God specifically. We have learned all this through Ellen White's letter 253 from 1903. Remember, this data was not available prior to 2015. And I find myself blessed when God showed me this letter in my personal studies, because this letter teaches me how to deal with the Trinity crisis today. It is in the same way Sister White dealt with it. And ask yourself, do we today, when we are having theological debates of the Trinity, do we talk about these 2 points? Fundamental principles, number one, and the doctrine on the personality of God, number two. These are the essence of the matter. And unfortunately, we are not talking about that. While yet, I believe that this is a common ground between a majority of our people today. As we're going to see, this is not the only occasion where Sister White was dealing with the Trinity doctrine in its context. There is more data to it, and we're going to look at it in some of them in the further studies, but all of them reveal the same behavior from Sister White. Whenever she was dealing with the Trinity doctrine, she was exalting the truth on the personality of God, and she was pointing us back to our Seventh-day Adventist faith, the fundamental principles. You see that Ellen White's behavior in regard to the Trinity doctrine is completely different than ours. Ellen White is operating on completely another dimension. So let's visualize it. So Sister White was not talking about Trinitarian and anti-Trinitarians. And this is something over this line we have so much discussions and so much of antagonism between these two groups. Well, Sister White, she's operating on completely another level. So this level is about personality of God. She was pointing us back to the personality of God and to the danger of spiritualism. So Trinitarians and anti-Trinitarians alike can be a spiritualist in this area. And this pro-Trinitarian and anti-Trinitarian distinction does not serve the purpose of recognizing and acknowledging the truth. In order to be a Trinitarian, all that you have to do, so to be on this side, you have to nominally adhere to the Trinity doctrine. You just have to say, I believe in a Trinity. And to be on this side, all that you have to say is just nominally reject the Trinity. This distinction is easy, but it's very fundamentally flawed. It doesn't make any distinction from the truth and error. On the other hand, the line that makes the distinction between truth and error is the doctrine on the personality of God. In the next study, we are going to dive deep into this doctrine and see a clear cut between the truth of the personality of God and the spiritualism. We're going to compare the writings of our pioneers on the personality of God with the sentiments in the Living Temple. In this way, you may see clearly the area or common ground between the Trinitarians and anti-Trinitarians. So see you in the next study.